Hi, this is Brass Check, and we're recording this on Sunday, May 7th, 2023. And you haven't heard from us in a while. We have been very busy putting the final touches on the printed version of the documentary Fauci's First Fraud. Yes, we're taking that documentary, which we released in August of 2020, nearly 3 years ago, and we're putting it in the covers of a book. It's going to be very powerful. I don't know if you've ever made a book. It is the most hard work, other than digging coal and picking cotton. It is brutal hard work. All the details, writing it, laying it out, making sure everything's got to be perfect. You can't have any flaws in it. It's just a tremendous amount of work. To say we're understaffed would be an understatement. But thanks to you, loyal Brass Check supporters, we have a little bit of breathing space to be able to do this important work. If you're new, we have been doing this since 1997. I'm not going to give the whole long list of all the things that we've scooped people on, but 9/11, how about 9/11 on the day, calling it, saying that it could not have been Osama bin Laden, it had to be an inside job. We were one of only 3 people that went out on a limb that day and said it. Anyway, that's ancient history. Here's modern history. February 1st, 2020, that's right, before the lockdowns, we declared the entire thing a fraud. We said exactly what it was about. We said exactly how it was going to end. And by God, it only took 2 tweets to explain the whole thing, and we were 100% right. So our track record is pretty good. We consistently publish things about COVID and many other subjects. We've got 3 books out already related to COVID. One is the Unraveling the COVID Con Volume 1, that's the red book. Unraveling the COVID Con Volume 2, that's the blue book. And the 75th commemorative anniversary of the Nuremberg Code. And we could spend a whole hour on that alone, but I'll spare you that. But if that's a book you really should be, you should own it. The new book, again, Fauci's First Fraud. I believe the subtitle is going to be Present at the Creation of a Totalitarian Medical State. Something like that. It's so hard coming up with the right words. But we will have the right words, and the book is going to be fantastic. I think it won't get the same support that Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book got, but it will be as important a book. In fact, Robert F. Kennedy drew from our film heavily. There's one chapter where he cited that film 10% of all the, more than 10% of all the references he made to Fauci in one chapter in his book came straight from our film. And he was good enough to give us credit in every place. So good guy. The rest of the resistance has done a really good job of ignoring us. I don't know why. I don't know what they think they're gaining from it. As these books that we produce come out, it's going to be obvious who was doing the good research and who was really slow on the draw. But that's neither here nor there. But anyway, a good researcher, though she doesn't return my emails either, but she's really good, is Sasha Latypova. And she does really good, detailed research. I think her greatest hit is documenting the reality that the U.S. military was actually the logistics arm for racing through these vaccines. Remember Operation Warp Speed? Remember they put a general in charge? That wasn't just an accident, but nobody until Sasha came along bothered to look into the details of that, and she's looked into it very deeply. Now, on her Substack, she has published a really good article that I recommend people read. It's called Interesting Data on the Spanish Flu, is published by accident. Believe me, folks, because I've been following this for, I don't know, are we into the 3rd year? I don't know what year we're in, but I've been following this since the beginning. There's a lot of easily learned information about the so-called Great Flu, the Spanish flu of 1918, that would reveal to anybody that spends time thinking about it that too was a fraud. I've given all the evidence of it. It appears in the Blue Book. It's in Unraveling the COVID Con Volume 2. I went into great detail there. But Sasha comes up with a really cool graph, which we're looking at right now. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the number of deaths by infectious disease. Okay? Not, getting run over by a car, not diabetes, not cancer, nothing like that. Not garden variety old age, but somebody caught something and it killed them. If you look at this chart, it's very, very interesting. Now, Sasha highlighted a couple of things that are really important that I'm going to draw your attention to. But let's look all the way to the left side of this chart. In the early 1800s, when New York City was rural, and actually even my grandmother remembers when there were a few farms left in the Bronx. I can't even fathom how that could even be possible, but my grandmother said there were a couple of little farms left in the Bronx when she was a girl. So, but anyway, in the first half, roughly the first quarter of the 1800s, New York was pretty rural, and it had all the problems undeveloped rural areas have. First of all, no penicillin, no antibiotics, but also inconsistent water quality, and that'll kill you fast. So the death rate, as you can see, was pretty significant. Then I see there's a huge spike. That was probably that might have been yellow fever, believe it or not. There was a big yellow fever epidemic in a lot of American cities, purely a function of sanitation and the lack of sanitation. Then they got a handle on that. They brought it back to normal. Then it shot up again. Don't know what that was. But I'll tell you, my great aunt, different branch of the family, told me when she was a girl, they didn't have running water in their apartment. Nobody did. If you needed water, you went out to the back. There was one pipe. You filled 2 buckets and you carried it upstairs. So all cooking, all casual cleaning had to be handled that way, and who knows how safe that water was. One branch of our family, over half the kids died. This is grandparent era, turn of the early part of the 20th century in New York City. They just flat out died. But believe it or not, the time that they lived when things were so rough, if you look at the chart, again, it spikes in 1850. It goes back. It reverts to the norm. And then something happened. I think they started pumping fresh water in New York City, and they started putting in indoor toilets. It took a while for everyone to get one, believe me. My great-grandparents, forget my great-grandparents, my grandparents grew up as kids without indoor plumbing in New York City. Think of the ramifications of that. Think of the ramifications of a super crowded apartment in a super crowded building in a super crowded neighborhood. Is there any wonder people were dropping like flies? So anyway, things started to get better around, looks like 1870, and the trend was good. It started to decline. By the time my great aunt was born, it was finally back to where it was in the early 1800s before the city was turned into a urban zoo. In the 1800s, the Bowery was a farm. This was way back, right? That's the word for farm in Dutch. Anyway, let's look at the chart. Let's go back to the chart. So things declined really well. And then in 1918, there was this little blip. Happens all the time, not just in epidemics or health. It happens in finances. It happens in the, how many sea turtles there are. I mean, there's never a straight line. Things are always bouncing around, and this was a little bit of a bounce. But look how small it is in 1918. You see that, where she writes LOL, laughing out loud. She points to the 1918. Compare it to just 50 years earlier. I mean, my God, it never, even at the height of the so-called Spanish flu, it didn't even get back to how bad it was in 1900. And it wasn't even close. I mean, look at the left hand of this chart. People were dropping like flies. All right. So then the influenza, the Great Flu, the Great Spanish Flu, worked its way through, did what it did, ran its course, and then the trend reversed, the positive trend reversed. And what contributed to that positive trend? I'll tell you right now, reliable, potable drinking water and good sanitation. And that's, you can see those, see how the chart levels out after, so it hits a big little peak at the influenza, 1918 influenza, and then it goes right back down, and then it kind of levels from then, let's call it 1920, all the way to, I don't know what that is, 1990? So from 1920 to 1990, it was at a nice low level and very steady. Why? Because our infrastructure was very steady. There were no degradations of it. Once you give everybody indoor plumbing and safe water, the infectious disease rate's gonna really go down to next to nothing, which is what it did. And then when it hit around 1990, it looks like, or late 80s, it started to decline. It started to break the trends going down. Things got even better and better and better and better until 2020. We had the scamdemic. Now look at the scamdemic. It's in red. Okay, they told us the world was coming to an end. Everyone was dying. Oh, the hospitals, no, there's no room in the hospital. Blah, this bullshit. And at the peak of the dying, it only got back to where it was, we'll say let's say 1990. So we'd made some progress, not huge progress, but we made some nice, decent progress from 1990 to 2020, pre-scamdemic. And then we had a blip, because there always are blips in this world and life. And if anybody doesn't know that, when you get out of nursery school, you will learn it. But anyway, look at that. Look at that. Even at the height of, and using their scam-ridden numbers, the death rate during the height of the scamdemic wasn't any worse than what the death rate was from 1920 straight through to, I'm going to say, about 1990. That's interesting, huh? But there's more, and this is what I wrote Sasha about, and she did not respond to me, and I got to be honest, I'm pissed off at all these people that don't respond. They have a lot to learn from me, and they waste a lot of time and a lot of people's energy by not being informed. But what can I do? Maybe she'll reform herself. I don't know. But what I told her in writing is, not only was the 2020 scamdemic a scam, the Great Spanish Flu was a scam. And I'll prove it many different ways. It's in the book. You really should get the book. It would be good to have it. That's the blue book. That's the volume 2. I gave a whole podcast, lecture, interview where I went into it in depth. But short version, we had a big war in 1918. I know some people may have forgotten. It was called World War I. It was devastating. And we talk about supply chain problems. There were over 300 reported and recorded major food riots in the country of Germany during World War I. When have you heard of a food riot anywhere, even in the third freaking world? Okay, Germany, a developed country at the time, a very well-developed country at the time, one of the most advanced countries at the time, had over 300 reported major food riots. When you can't get food to your population, that's a little bit of a supply chain problem. And if you're not getting food to people, I guarantee you're not getting medicine to them, and you're not getting medical care. All right. So there was talk about disruption. World War I was a massive disruption. So an increase in the death rate, whether, even if it was attributed to infectious disease, has to also be attributed to malnutrition, intensive stress, lack of medical care. Speaking of lack of medical care, when World War I started, the U.S. had, I think, 2 mules and 3 guys and an old cannon. I mean, really, we had no military at all pre-World War I. And there was an enormous mobilization of the kind we have never seen in our history. Even World War II wasn't quite as dramatic. And they had to put a lot of stuff together very fast. And one of the things they needed to put together was a medical corps for this huge multi-million person military that they created from scratch. Where do you think they got those doctors and nurses from? They were not in the military. Now, if we go to war, we already have like a full house full of doctors and nurses. Maybe we need a few more, but we're pretty much staffed. They had nothing. So you know where they got them from? They took the best and the brightest from all the hospitals in the civilian sector. Look it up. It's history. It's not a conspiracy theory. So what happened now? On the best of times, hospitals are killing fields. I mean, they're getting worse and worse. United States hospitals, they're getting worse and worse and worse and more incompetent with every passing day. When you take the strong hands out and you're leaving the weakest players, what do you think is going to happen? A whole lot of people that might have lived are going to die. So that was another big contribution to the death rate in the United States. The third thing that some people talk about, and they think they've invented this and discovered it, believe me, those of us who've been looking at these things have been aware for decades about this. The Great Spanish Flu broke out on a U.S. Army base in Kansas. Okay? A whole bunch of guys that died of this thing. Because remember, they stressed, young people in the prime of life, young men. They always talk about young men, by the way. Women didn't get drafted in those days. They always talked about the shock of young men in the prime of life dying. Well, most of those young men that died in the prime of life of an infectious disease had been recently vaccinated. A whole bunch of them in Kansas, and then there was a large kill-off of guys on the troop transport ships going from U.S. to Europe. What do you think they did to those guys right before they put them on the boat? Yes, they vaccinated them. What were they vaccinating them against? Primarily typhus, but a whole bunch of other things. They knew, because they've been watching the war for a while, that these guys were going to be sitting in trenches for months at a time without safe water, without sanitation, and typhus was killing more people than bullets. Okay, so the Pentagon and what was then called the Rockefeller Institute, these guys are always around, did a crash course, a warp speed development of a typhus vaccine. And if you were in the military, it was your job to roll up your arm and get it. And were those people who died on the military base and died on those troop transports on the boats going over to England, going over to Europe, were they killed by the vaccine? I really don't know, but it's sure a weird coincidence. So anyway, those are some of the reasons why we had a great Spanish flu. Extreme stress, extreme disruption, severe food shortages all over the world, but especially in Europe. And all those things will lead to a minor, and you can look at the chart, it is a pretty minor blip. You had a good downward trend, and then suddenly it sort of evened out, and then you had a little pop, and then it went right back, and it actually went even lower. But there's one other thing, and this is I put in my letter to Sasha, which she ignored. I don't know why people ignore these things, but they do. Nobody at the time, other than putting masks on people insanely, and it was determined that they didn't work, but nobody during that great flu really did any kind of a serious study of how many people died, what they were dying of. There was very little lab work, no autopsies. Things were just attributed. Even Fauci somewhere he admitted that, they didn't really die of the flu, they died of bacterial infection. So, nobody believes, even the professional liars don't believe that there was a crazy flu that killed everybody. Only people that read the comic books known as the mass media think that. But it gets even better. In the 1920s, long after the flu was over and everybody was dead and buried, some people decided, let's try to do an estimate of how many people died of this thing that we call the Spanish flu. And they came up with an estimate of 20 million people. Just 20 million people globally, right? Not just in the U.S., but in the entire globe. And I've already pointed out how exaggerated that number is. They're not attributing malnutrition. They're not attributing lack of medical care. They're just claiming that this thing killed 20 million people. Just a lot like what they're doing with COVID today. But let's say we accept that number of 20 million, all right? After they did their estimate, there was no more discussion for 60 years. Roughly 60 years. Every now and then they, do a little news item. Oh, the Great Flu, remember? Oh, it was bad. But no big deal. Then starting in the early 80s, there was suddenly a gold rush. There was all kinds of funding available to do retrospective studies on the Great Flu in the 1980s. What changed in the 1980s? Well, in the 1970s, it was becoming obvious, and you can see from looking at this chart why it was becoming obvious. There really was no need to have a big bureaucracy called the Centers for Disease Control, because the CDC has to do with infectious diseases. And clearly, we had solved, to the degree that was possible, the infectious disease problem. And so a lot of congressmen and other people looking for budgets to cut were looking at the CDC and thinking these guys need to be trimmed or maybe even eliminated. And if you read Peter Duesberg's book, I believe it's called The Invention of the AIDS Virus, very hard to get, by the way, extremely hard to get. They've done everything they can to make that book disappear, but you can find copies if you hunt around, but they're very expensive. But in any event, what he points out in his book is the CDC went into overdrive to start to justify its existence. And I believe that one of the programs to help justify the existence of the CDC was to blow up the story of the 1918 Great Spanish Flu. And suddenly, 60 years later, the records didn't get any better between 1920 and 1980, right? At least in 1920, you maybe could find some paper records. You could maybe go and talk to the heads of hospitals. You could actually look around. 1980, everybody's dead. I bet most of those paper records are gone, but infinite amount of money was made available for people to write. And lo and behold, they discovered that it wasn't just 20 million people that died of the Great Flu. It was 50. Yeah, it was 50. And then they started turning this over to popularizers, people that don't have science backgrounds, people that can say anything they want and get away with it. It won't hurt their science credentials. And these people starting to say, well, the estimate is 50 million, but experts believe it's more like 100 million. There's no expert that says that. But there are a whole bunch of writers, magazine writers and book writers that have been saying that consistently, nonstop since the 1980s. If you go to Google, look up books on the Great Flu, on the Spanish flu, on whatever you want to call it, and even pre-COVID-19, they were coming out like crazy, and they all had the same story. Once there was a flu, and it was so unpredictable, and so unprecedented, and so dramatic, and so lethal, that it just killed people to an extent never before seen in human history, unless you went back 20 years and looked at a fucking chart. And if you went back another 50 years for a total of 70 years, you'll realize that even at the height of the Great Flu, the Great Spanish Flu that supposedly killed everybody, that was a picnic. That was a good time compared to what it was like in 1900, certainly in 1850, and in those latter years of the 19th century. Pardon the profanity, but people are dying because of this lie. So what they did was they created a myth of the Great Spanish Flu in the 1980s, right? They retroactively went back and created a narrative about what actually happened in 1918, and they started beating that drum. And I'm telling you, now that you know this, every time you see a story about pandemics, epidemics, scamdemics, whatever it is, you will see them going on and on and on about the Great Flu, and we're waiting for the big one. The big one's going to, the big one came once before. It's going to come back. We're just waiting for the big one. The big one is inevitable. Blah, blah, blah. It is no such thing. Look at the chart. Look at where we were, for, let's say, around 30, when actually there were a lot of great infrastructure, urban infrastructure improvements made in New York City. From about 1930 to about, I'm telling you, right, 1930 all the way to 2020. So that's 90 years. We had 90 years of no worries, no excessive worries about infectious disease. Do they occur? Yes, they occur. Do they need to be treated? Yes, they need to be treated. Should they be prevented? Yes, they should be prevented. But we had knocked it down to a point that it was so low that it was insignificant, even with the scamdemic. But nobody looks at numbers, nobody looks at charts, and everybody is still believing that nature, takes these viruses out of the blue. By the way, I love people go, well, people are flying around more than they used to, and there's never been this level of traffic. Bullshit. Anybody remember the Vietnam War? We were flying hundreds of thousands of guys in and out of Southeast Asia. How many diseases and weird biological things do you think live in the jungles of Southeast Asia? And we were sending them over and bringing them back. And I think it was by the time that war was over, we had done millions of guys, dipped them into this very strange and harsh biosphere, and brought them back to the United States. Nobody worried about them bringing some pandemic from the jungle from a bat. No, because we wanted them to go over and kill Vietnamese peasants so that we could, do whatever it was that we thought we needed to do over there. That was the value, But now we got a different value. The value is to scare the public out of its mind. And I live in an area where I still see people in masks, and I go to independent bookstores, indie bookstores. And the staffs are still wearing masks. This is freaking May 7th, 2023. Even though the World Health Organization has declared this thing over. And we've got, people all over the place still wearing masks, quaking in their boots, worried about the next pandemic. And the news media is going to do everything they can to keep that fear fire burning. So anyway, hats off to Sasha for finding this publicly available chart and for bringing it to everybody's attention and for making these interesting remarks on it. The bottom line is infectious diseases pretty much ceased to be a problem in the modern world, around in New York City at least, starting in 1930. And yeah, we had, even if you accept the scamdemic numbers, and I want to be absolutely clear, I think most of the people that died in the hospital of COVID were flat out murdered by incompetence or by negligent homicide, or in some cases just straight up malfeasance. Hospitals do kill people by mistake or through incompetence. It happens every day of the week, and if you don't believe it, just look at all the lawsuits hospitals have to face, and deserve to face, by the way. So, but we'll accept the scam-ridden, scamdemic numbers and say that they were true. Even if they were at the height of the scamdemic, we only got back to where we were in basically 1990. And I don't think anybody was complaining about an outbreak of infectious disease from 1930 to 1990, or 1920 or 30. I don't know. You have to double check the arithmetic, but whether it's 60 or 70 years is irrelevant. I don't think the last 70 years, let's say, the world has been in a panic about infectious diseases. But today it is, not because there's a reality, but it's because of manipulation of the news and the news media, manipulation of science, the absolute abject failure of universities to do their job, which is to promote science and debate. They have completely and utterly failed. The news media expect, they're a bunch of lying thieves. They've always been. That's never going to change, right? And universities aren't that much better, but they were at least a degree better. But they are now worse. They're now worse. Remember, many universities in this country coerced their students to get a unproven medical experiment, to participate in an unproven medical experiment that has the highest record of injury and death of any so-called vaccine ever given in the history of mankind. All right, and as recently as now. There are still universities and colleges that are coercing their young students, basically telling them, if you don't comply with this medical experiment, you will be denied access to an education. Now, yes, they could stay home and read books. They could go to another college that doesn't have these totalitarian measures in place. But you know what? people bond with the school. They certainly bond with their fellow their classmates. They bond with some teachers. They have a career at a school, so they're giving up a lot. And they look around them. And they think, well, the professors say we should do this. The administration says we do this, and Tony Fauci says we should do this, and CNN says we should do this, and Joseph Biden says we should do this, and even Donald Trump, the great liberator, says we should do this. And by the way, please, guys, stop sending me pro-Trump stuff. Can we wake up? This guy was completely part of this thing. He was the warp speed dude. He couldn't get a vaccine developed fast enough. Okay, and by the way, I don't see any record that he personally got it. The only news report I ever saw about Trump and the vaccine was that he hadn't gotten it yet and he was going to get around to it. Well, I think that getting around to it never happened. So please, guys, if you're a big donor and you love Trump, I guess I lost you. But you know what? I don't care, because you're not thinking clearly. Okay. But anyway, so here you are, a college student, and all these people are telling you this is the thing you have to do, and you'd kind of like to continue your education. So you roll up your sleeve. You're not told it's a medical experiment. You're told it's a safe and effective vaccine. The evil of this, the depravity of this, the criminality of this is just off the charts. But anyway, speaking of a chart, take a look. This is the reality of infectious disease in New York City. And it's probably similar to other cities in America, and probably similar to the countryside. As we got better plumbing and more reliable, safer water, the infectious disease rate got knocked down as far as it can possibly go. And even with the scamdemic, we never exceeded the baseline that we established. Looks like the 20s or 30s in New York City, when we finally got indoor plumbing in all residences, and we finally got potable water piped to every apartment. That's what human beings need. By the way, they need that in Africa. They need that in Africa right now. They're not getting that in Africa. And what is Bill Gates bringing them? He's bringing them vaccines instead of water systems and sanitation systems. Okay, Mr. Public Health, Mr. I want to save the world. This thing is so transparently fraudulent. It boggles my mind that anyone with an IQ over 5 can't see it. But in any event, thanks to Sasha for putting up this chart. Sasha, it would be nice if you returned my emails. It would be nice if you would engage me in conversation, but, it's not a requirement. But anyway, thanks for your work, which is superb. Thanks for this very simple chart. I didn't have this one. I knew all the other stuff that I shared on this call, but this one, it just never occurred to me to look at a chart like this. So what... What they're trying to do is say, oh my God, this thing was so bad. We had this big increase that never was before seen. Yes, but if you look at the long chart, it never even got back to the levels that we had pre-plumbing and pre-potable water in New York City. Didn't even get close. Anyway, this has been Brass Check. To everybody that supports us, if you're liking this content, you're getting what you're paying for, I hope. And we appreciate you. When you see you've got the Nuremberg Code book, I hope you have the two Unraveling the COVID Con books. You're going to have to get the Fauci's First Fraud book. I mean, when you see this thing, just the cover alone, and you're going to have it, you'll see that your money is really well spent. We're working ourselves really hard to get who puts out 4 books in less than a year? Not even publishing houses do, right? And we're doing these websites and all this other work that we have to do to pay the bills. But anyway, thanks to you. You're making it possible. Could not do it without you. No way, no how. So if you're supporting us, thank you very much. If you're not supporting us, well, think about it. Think about what you are supporting. Because I guarantee you're paying for your internet access, and you're paying Google, and you're paying Facebook, probably, and Twitter. If you use those services, you are paying. Even if they're so-called free, they're not free. You're generating revenue from them by using them. So who do you support? I know who I support. If I give money to somebody, it's somebody that's reporting real stuff. I'm not spending lots of money on anything other than that. But anyway, thank you very much. And this went a little longer than I thought, but look at this chart. This chart tells it all. We have won. The plumbers of the world, the civil engineers of the world have performed a miracle for humanity. They have reduced the death of infectious disease from a big deal to a relatively rare occurrence. And who's thanking them? Nobody. But meanwhile, we have an out-of-control industrial medical complex that's ripping us off at every chance, that lies through its teeth, and that and now is I mean, they've been doing it for decades, but now it's they have an all-out war on every honest doctor, on every honest scientist, on every honest journalist. It's really quite a thing. So will we prevail? I don't know. But we're doing our end, you're doing your end, and maybe we'll have a breakthrough and something really significant will happen to start turning this around.
Brass Check TV, free to you, not free to us. We've got a server bill, we've got an email software bill, we've got a tech helper bill, and that happens every month. So to everybody that is supporting us financially, that's paying for their subscription in one way or another, we really appreciate it. If you're not, consider doing so. Everybody's got money for the newspaper and the cable bill and all that. Do you have money for media that's actually serving you? That's really the issue here. And when you help us, it allows us to get this information out to the world. So thanks to all our supporters, and if you're not a supporter already, please consider becoming one.